Hello, Sean Munger here. I'm That History Guy, and we're dealing with the historical context of the James Bond films. This is number 3, Goldfinger. Goldfinger is, of course, the apotheosis of the James Bond movies. It's regarded as a classic, and rightfully so. It's got everything. It's got the glamorous women, the crazy villain, the henchman with a bizarre way of killing people, the Aston Martin, gadgets, glittering sets designed by Ken Adam, John Barry score, and Shirley Bassey singing the theme song. Goldfinger is also, I think, to an extent, not true of any of the other films, absolutely a product of the moment in which it was made. Everything about the film screams 1964. Historically, 1964 was probably the most important year of the 60s, and it's the fulcrum, so to speak, between the optimism and glamour of the early 1960s and the depressing, violent, and nihilistic mess that the late 1960s ultimately became. So what was going on in 1964 while Goldfinger was in production? Culturally speaking, Great Britain was a colossus astride the Western world, thanks in part to James Bond, but thanks even more to the Beatles. It's hard to overestimate the impact that the Beatles had, especially when they appeared on American television, The Ed Sullivan Show, in February 1964. That's the British invasion that people talk about in pop culture. And this was just weeks after the principal photography on Goldfinger started in Miami. 1964 was also a year of increasing turmoil in the United States. The new U.S. President, Lyndon Johnson, who took over upon John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, he was trying to get elected in his own right and also dealing with issues of civil rights and a deepening crisis in Southeast Asia. Thanks in part to Johnson's political skill and as a tribute to the dead President John F. Kennedy, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed racial discrimination in numerous areas of commerce within the United States. The Civil Rights Act triggered nothing short of a political realignment in the United States. Previously, people who were opposed to racial integration, mostly in the South, but in many parts of the North too, they traditionally had been Democrats. LBJ from Texas was a Democrat, but after 1964, those voters rapidly began shifting toward the Republican Party. LBJ is said to have remarked, as he signed the Civil Rights Act into law, "Well, I've just lost the South to the Democrats for a generation." He turned out to be right, of course. Many southern states would not vote for a Democrat again until Barack Obama in the 21st century, and even then, only a handful. Of course, internationally, the major thing going on in 1964 was Vietnam. In August 1964, while Goldfinger was in post-production, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, resulting in the U.S. granting President Johnson prospective authority to use direct military force in Vietnam. He would begin using that authority in February 1965 with direct airstrikes against North Vietnam, and then again in July 1965, introducing American combat troops on the ground directly for the first time. Goldfinger premiered in September 1964. The U.S. presidential campaign was then in full swing, with Johnson facing off against Republican Barry Goldwater, who would go on to lose badly. There was also an election going on in the UK. The premiership of Alec Douglas Home Conservative Party was short-lived. The election, which occurred on October 15, 1964, resulted in a narrow victory by the Labour Party, and Harold Wilson became prime minister. The impact of Goldfinger was huge. It was a gigantic hit, a mega blockbuster, spawned a great deal of merchandising, which was kind of unusual and groundbreaking for a movie at this time. The cultural reach of Goldfinger was very long. Together with the popularity of the Beatles, the movie put London at the center of the cool universe in 1965 and 1966. This was the beginning of the mod era, a new era of fashion, music, and youth culture centered around London and around London hipsters, or what we would call hipsters today. There's still barely enough of that gee-whiz attitude in Goldfinger, that early optimism of the 60s, to capture the lingering days of the early 60s ethos that you see in the earlier pictures. The year 1965, however, ends all of that, and you can see that in the next film, the next Bond film, Thunderball, which I'll get to in the next video. Thanks.